I'm Malcolm Roberts and I'm here with Dan Macdonald, and we're about how far from Charleville? Hour and a half?
Yeah, about 150 kilometres, mate. Yeah.
Okay. And we're on a cattle station called Wairarapa. So, Dan, tell us how you got into farming.
About 15 years ago, Malcolm, we bought this property, my wife and I. I grew up in a farming area in the New South Wales Hunter Valley.
I was in the Hunter Valley, it was great.
Yep. So that's sort of where I grew up, and but came here 15 years ago. This is our first large property of our own, as such. So.
And what were you doing? What are some of the things you did before you got into farming?
In order to generate the financial capacity to buy the property, my wife and I had an earth moving business, plant hire.
Okay. In the Hunter Valley?
Yeah.
Okay. Which town?
A place called Yarramalong.
I should know where
west
that
of
is.
Wyong.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
All right. One of the things that's always impressed me is the farmers have to be jack of all trades. What are some of the skills that you have? And I'm not talking about formal skills, they don't mean much to me.
Yep.
I mean the skills, some of the jobs you have to do.
Oh mate, we sort of cover everything from construction, welding, boilermaker,
Did you make the guest quarters?
Yep.
I guess
everything here we've built ourselves, yeah.
And it's solid, and it's comfortable, and it's pleasant to be in, and a lot of welding in there, a lot of fine tuning. Did Katrina have much to do with it?
Oh, a little bit. We can't sort of rule her out of it all.
Okay, so you also have to be engineering.
Yep.
You built that 26-metre long pipe that you used to
For feeding cattle.
Feeding cattle.
Yep.
You dragged that behind a dozer, which you've modified.
That's right. Yep.
And now, because the law changes, you've had to change it, and instead of dragging it behind, you've got to put a shorter one in front.
That's right. Yeah. Yep. That's the Vegetation Act. Yep.
So that's design, engineering design. You've then got to build it. So you're a boilermaker. You probably did the wiring for the electricals around here.
Absolutely. Yep.
And I asked your son Reese if something goes wrong with the Toyota electrically, does he call out an auto electrician, or do you have to limp into town? He said, no, Dad does everything. So you carpenter.
Yep.
You have to understand soil, have to understand the weather.
Absolutely.
So you're what, at the northern part of the winter rain?
Yeah, we can get winter rain here.
Not reliably.
No, not reliably, and we get that summer influence from the north. So it can at times work very well where you can jag both, but you can also miss both.
So what are some? You have to be a vet.
Yep.
You have to be a nurse if something happens here.
Yep.
You have to have good teamwork skills because you've got to get on with the neighbours. You have to have good leadership skills.
Practically everything we do, because of a remote location, you have to do yourself.
So you're a diesel mechanic.
Yep.
Petrol engine mechanic with the you use motorbikes, don't you? No horses.
Yeah, no horses. No.
Okay. What else do you have to do?
Hydraulics. Hydraulics as far as machinery, also as far as water. Plumbing.
Yep.
All our stock water.
Everything.
Yep.
And then your wife does schooling. So she's a teacher.
Yep. Through distance ed. That's right.
Yep.
I guess in recent times I've had to educate myself legally.
Oh hell, that's right. I remember being with Lyle and Madonna Simmons at a property not far from Mitchell, and she said that they work long hours, and especially at certain times of the year, and they come in absolutely knackered, and they find a folio of stuff that they've got to go through because of property laws and that legislation and other requirements. So you had to be a lawyer, and I thought, how can you do that when you're not used to that kind of work? I know trying to do that drives me insane, but you try to do that and you're already buggered.
Yeah,
you've got to be fresh.
That's right. It's getting more difficult all the time. There's literally hundreds of pieces of legislation, as I've learned, that impact on our day-to-day business.
Yeah,
and it's an absolute minefield.
Who does your accounting?
We have the same accountant we used to use down in New South Wales. Still
so
does.
You ship it down to him?
Yeah, but essentially Katrina does all of it. He only sort of checks it and signs off on it.
Right. So a hell of a lot of skills. What issues do you face?
Oh, wide and varied.
What are your big challenges for the future?
Biggest challenges for the future?
Challenges now that will affect the future.
By and large, mate, the most primary one would be government regulation.
And what sort of regulations?
regulation of every facet of our business. I guess the primary one that's really starting to bite now is regulation of our asset, our land, our vegetation.
So when you bought this property, you particularly paid attention to it being drought proof because of the mulga.
That's right. Yeah.
So for those who don't know, mulga, you want to describe that?
Oh, well, mulga is an extremely drought tolerant species of vegetation.
And to be more specific and accurate, I think it's really a woody weed. It's not a majestic tree.
Oh no, definitely not.
It's a bit more than just a
it's scrub, you know. But it is extremely drought tolerant, and since European settlement, mate, it's been the primary source of grazing in this part of the world.
And I know from Madonna and Lyle Connolly, they took me around areas of their property which had just grass, and originally it was all grass before Europeans arrived. Yep. And also Nigel Brumpton took me and showed me some of the grassland there, and it's all flat and no erosion gullies. But you go into the mulga and you've got to drive really carefully because of all the erosion under the mulga.
Yeah. When the vegetation gets, you know, to such a density, it just chokes out any ground cover.
Yeah, so it's actually not helping the environment.
Oh no.
And you're ending up with the rivers in the Murray-Darling Basin, because the Warrego goes into the Murray-Darling Basin, silting up.
Yeah, I guess the primary reason for that is the absence of fire since European settlement. You know, that's what's caused the thickening. Now, when you're in a business where you require vegetation, whether it be, you know, mulga or grass for grazing, you have a vested interest to maximise the volume of that plant material for your business. So I guess since European settlement, a lot of graziers have seen burning as a bit of a no-no.
Yep.
You know? But of course, we're now seeing the impacts of not burning.
And mulga's taking over.
Absolutely.
And in the mulga country, there's not much that lives in that thick, dense scrub.
We call it a mulga desert.
Yes.
There's nothing there.
Yeah, and yet this is the stuff these people in Brisbane rather, are wanting to protect.
Yeah, I mean, if you want biodiversity in an area like this, you need, you know, you need exactly that. You need a great mix of plant species, and then you'll get all the different animals. Whereas when you've got thick mulga scrub, that's all you'll have.
Yeah, and so ideally you'd go back to pre-European days and have grasslands, but you'd like to keep some of the mulga because it drought proofs, because your stock can eat mulga.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like every business, mate, is a juggling act of managing the resource. And yeah, definitely we wouldn't want to be without mulga. We really wouldn't. The problem we've got is that the government's attitude to managing our vegetation is simply to lock it up.
Yeah, and so you bought this property for the grass, for the mulga, for the soil. Any other assets? Well,
the primary ingredient, if you like, you need for a grazing business are vegetation and water
and soil.
And soil, obviously the soil's holding it all together.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the primary thing, and yeah, that's why we're here. And obviously the biggest problem we've got, reflecting back on your question there, is the fact that we now have regulation, government regulation of our water and of our vegetation.
Right, so they're regulating the two key inputs.
Yep, absolutely.
And maybe we'll get on to something else later on in regulation, but let's go through the history of this mulga legislation, or this native vegetation protection legislation. Understanding that mulga didn't dominate here, but it's now starting to because of legislation. So with that in mind, it started in 1996?
Yeah, exactly.
So tell us what happened.
Yeah, well, I've been on a very sharp learning curve, Malcolm, in relation to all of this.
So your whole business is threatened?
Absolutely, and it's really only been the last couple of years that I've had to educate myself in how this has all come to be. And essentially what did happen back in 1996-97, the Federal Coalition signed Australia up, or agreed to commit Australia to the Kyoto Protocol.
Yeah, they didn't sign it, did they?
No.
Because John Howard made a big point about that. We will not sign the Kyoto Protocol, and everyone gave him a clap. But he said we will comply with it.
Yeah, and so what that brought about at that time was all the states, but particularly in here, talking about Queensland, was the start of the Integrated Planning Act for Queensland, which was the start of planning legislation, regulation.
What was the agreement that he signed with Rob Borbidge?
That was the National Heritage Trust agreement.
That predated the...
No, that's what came about as the carrot, if you like, that the federal government dangled for the states to sign up to that agreement to access funds from Telstra shares, the sale of Telstra shares. Essentially what happened there was the bilateral agreement for the National Heritage Trust required the states to implement legislation that created land clearing controls.
And that was signed, I remember the document because Lila Madonna Connolly showed me it. So it was signed on one side by the Prime Minister, John Howard.
That's right.
And his counterpart in Queensland, Rob Borbidge, the National Party Premier. Then the second signatory on the federal government side was John Anderson, from memory,
right.
Deputy Prime Minister and a National. The second signatory on the state government side was Brian Littleproud, was it? Environment Minister? Or Howard Hobbs?
Brian Littleproud was the Environment Minister.
Yep. So the National Party.
Yep.
And then the third signatory on the federal government side was Robert Hill.
That's right.
The Liberal Party Environment Minister.
Federal Environment Minister.
Yes, and the third one on the state was Howard Hobbs.
Was Howard Hobbs, which the Department of Natural Resources and Mines. He was the Minister for Natural Resources and Mines.
So we had a National Party, Liberal Party started this whole thing on
absolutely
rights, stealing property rights.
Yeah, I mean that came as a pretty big shock to me to learn that. You can imagine the feeling I had when learning that the side of politics that I'd essentially always supported in my voting life was the very party that's actually destroying my industry.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, in 2007 I wrote a letter to John Howard after he got booted from Prime Ministership. Because I looked at, I was at a museum one day and I looked at the Prime Minister of Australia and I saw John Howard's influence over 30 years and I thought, you might not agree with everything, but at least he's put a fair bit of work into it. So I wrote him a letter, just a very brief one, and not something I do a lot of, but when I was managing coal mines and general manager, I used to focus on the positives. So I thought I'd write him a letter. Dear Mr. Howard, thank you very much for what you've done, you know. 4 years later, I learned what he'd done. Not only this, but other stuff, renewable energy target, destroying manufacturing now, putting in place the first policy for a large party with an emissions trading scheme. The Labor Party and the Greens told the lies about this climate issue, but the Liberals meekly went along with it, and that endorsed it.
Absolutely.
And then, 6 years later, he stood up at a conference in London and said he was a skeptics conference. He was agnostic on climate science. In other words, he didn't really know which way the science was going. So he wrecked manufacturing, now he's destroying farming, and he almost wrecked the whole country with an emissions trading scheme, carbon dioxide tax, a CO2 tax. And there he was doing this, you know?
Yeah, following that policy.
Yeah,
or implementing that policy, essentially.
I wrote him a second letter and said I rescind my first letter. So you're not the only one who was fooled.
Oh, mate, I was extremely naive, and that's probably been one of the things that come as the biggest shock is that as I said earlier, they're supporting the coalition essentially all my life, and from a family that's done the same thing because we've lived in the rural primary industry sector, thinking that they had our best interest at heart, and then to turn around and find that they're essentially destroying us.
So they laid the foundation, the Liberal National Party.
Absolutely.
Then what was next? What was the next step? You talking about?
I guess so. What happened there when that first agreement was signed between the feds and the state? They implemented the Integrated Planning Act in 1997. Then in 1999,
that was Borbidge National Party government in this state.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep. So then in 1999, along came the Vegetation Management Act.
And Beattie became Premier in '98.
That's right.
Yeah, Peter Beattie from the Labor Party.
Now, the Vegetation Management Act, it's essentially all about locking up vegetation, carbon sequestration. It's all about meeting, emissions targets as such.
So that's
under the Kyoto
significant.
Protocol.
That's really significant because it's a federal push to do this.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's to comply with a UN requirement.
Yes.
That is voluntary, but we signed up. We didn't sign up for it. We said we would follow.
The states were coerced into following that policy financially. You know, it's, if you want the money, this is what you've got to do.
John Howard threw what, $200–300 million to the Labor state government under Beattie, saying get on with this job of locking up the land, stopping farmers clear their land.
But there was an ongoing dialogue, which I've got copies of all of it, between the states and the federal government at that time. So we had the Howard government essentially and the Beattie government to ramp up even more stringent controls. Further than what they'd gone with the Planning Act in 97 and the Veg Act in 99. The feds wanted more. So the correspondence there indicated we need more, we need more. We need
and to get more...
To get more, in 2004...
Give them cash.
The federal coalition agreed, or had an agreement with the states, with Queensland, which was the extension of the National Heritage Trust Agreement, which was essentially another round of cash, conditioned on further controls on vegetation. So that's why in 2000...
To stop farmers clearing land.
Yeah, so in 2004 we saw the most stringent controls come in Queensland on to the Veg Act. You know, that's where they really ramped it up, and in particular in 2004, that's where, and as all the correspondence shows from John Howard himself, that is where they sought to gain control over freehold land. So in the original act in 1999 was very much controlling state land, which by most measures, it's about 70% of the state of Queensland is state land. There's only about 30% is freehold. So that original act of 1999 practically covered 70% of the state, but Howard wanted more. His correspondence says it in those exact words: we need more, we need to implement controls over freehold land.
I've seen letters between him and Peter Beattie, and I've seen Bob Carr, the New South Wales Premier, I think he might have been Environment Minister at the time, do a video gloating. You could see the smile on his face, saying that we, New South Wales government, under the Labor government, took away farmers' property rights without paying compensation. And I think that's the key thing here, because this was done by a federal government to comply with a UN requirement.
That's right.
That is voluntary, but they then tried to mandate it all. Now, if the federal government takes anyone's property rights or interferes with people's property rights under section 51 clause 29,
it's 31 actually, yeah. 31,
okay.
Yeah.
Under that clause, if the federal government interferes with property rights, then they must provide just terms compensation.
That's right.
Now, they were doing this. Howard was pushing this. So he had to get around, and the reason why was to comply with Kyoto Protocol, the UN's Kyoto Protocol. You either had to shut down the production of carbon dioxide by shutting down power stations industry, which people back in 1996, 97, 98 would not have tolerated.
No.
Or you stop the clearing of land so that more trees are there supposedly to absorb carbon dioxide. So, which is while trees absorb carbon dioxide, we cannot influence the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's complete nonsense. The science shows that. Anyway. So what he had to do then was pay farmers compensation. To get around that, he threw cash, taxpayers funding this cash, to the state governments.
That's right.
So the state governments do it because the state governments don't have to pay you compensation.
That's right. In the state's constitution do not contain any provisions that say the taking of property must be under just terms.
So it was done. He was agnostic on climate science. He didn't know the science. He didn't know of any science that supported his push to the states. Not only did he do that without any basis, scientific basis, which still doesn't exist, he then went deceitfully around the Constitution.
Absolutely.
to stop you getting compensation.
Yeah. There has not been 1 cent paid in compensation.
So what we really need to push for and make people aware of is either restore your bloody rights or compensate you for them.
Exactly. Look, it's not rocket science, Malcolm. It's like for us in the mulga lands, where we now have regulation that allows us to use a very small amount of our vegetation, which is to an extent that it's unsustainable, would be like saying to a, let's say another regulated industry, let's say the taxi industry, where you might buy a fleet of taxis. Let's say you buy 100 taxis. which all have a licence plate regulated by government, and you pay a large amount of money for those 100 taxis, and then government coming along and saying, okay, in the interests of climate change and emissions targets, we're going to halve the number of taxis on the road, so you with your 100 taxis can only run 50. You've still got to pay the licence fees for 100, but you can only use 50 of them.
Or you can only use the front seat.
Exactly.
For passengers, so you cut your revenue.
Yeah.
Or it'd be like, and this has affected coastal residents' property rights, because some councils, based on this and claims by the UN, have tried to resume land without compensation, just steal people's houses. That's what they've tried to do in New South Wales and in Queensland, on the basis that sea levels will rise. That's another topic. But it's also affecting urban residents, because I know we have to get permission to do things on our land. We've got acreage on the edge of Brisbane. So it's affecting urban people. This is a measure to control people's property.
Yeah, so in this game we've got the two fundamental elements being vegetation and water, both regulated to an extent where we're becoming totally unsustainable.
But I bet your output's not regulated.
No.
I bet
every single facet of our inputs is regulated. Every one of them.
To list a few.
Our land, for one.
Yep.
Vegetation.
Yep.
Water.
Yep.
Everything we buy for our business, the way we conduct our business.
So any fertiliser you use, any chemicals you use?
Absolutely. We've got biosecurity regulation. As I say, all our inputs, I mean, everything we physically buy has come from another industry that's regulated.
Labour's regulated?
Labour's regulated. Transport. There's just physically not anything that is an input to our business that's not regulated.
And apart from some drought relief schemes, you don't get subsidies in this country pretty much. We don't get subsidies in farming. But the Americans give subsidies to dairy farmers, I think to many farmers right across the whole sector. They have stockpiles of stuff. Europeans give many, many subsidies. So your inputs are regulated.
Yep.
You don't control them. Your output is open to competition internationally against people who are subsidised by taxpayers.
That's right.
So you're jammed.
So, exactly. We're supposed to produce in a regulated market, yet then sell out through the farm gate into free market.
So that's a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. Well, it is. And this is why we've got farmers leaving the industry every day of the week.
And then you put a really onerous impost on their two basic water and
well, they're the two key ingredients. They really are key. Obviously everything else is quite important, but yeah, when you regulate the primary input being vegetation and water, you've substantially limited the productive capacity of the industry, of the nation. I mean,
so it would be like, to have another analogy, it'd be like having a house and 4-bedroom house and not being able to use the lounge room, a couple of bedrooms,
that's right,
kitchen maybe,
yeah,
and the rest of it you can live in.
Yet still having the same burden of rates.
Rates, electricity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
And there are actually worse things, because the climate change aspects are just one part of it, but there are other things to do with biodiversity and so-called sustainability in the UN that severely restrict people, right through to urban residents. So
it's well, it's already got to that point. As you know, mate, for the last 2 decades, 3 decades, people have been exiting this industry. It's just getting too hard, and every day we see another layer of regulation.
And sadly, because of the banks who hide behind regulations and have enormous power because of that, and they do hide behind regulation.
Yeah,
Peter Costello, the treasurer, you know, he had a pretty good reputation as treasurer, pretty switched on, lawyer,
yep,
well versed. He said last year, about September, October, he said, bank executives and bank shareholders can thank one entity for their massive salaries and massive profits. They can thank government regulation, because they hide behind it.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, mate. You know, you've got, I think in banking, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you've got the most profitable industry in the country, all done on the back of taxpayer funded guarantee, you know. the most profitable industry in the country, yet it does it on the back of government support, essentially. As you know, after that, 2008 global financial crisis, our government stepped in and said, we'll guarantee, with taxpayer funds, every deposit. You know?
And as the chair of the Senate Select Inquiry into lending to primary production customers, I was horrified with some of the things I saw. So you're getting walloped by government, tying up your resource. Some farmers are getting walloped by the banks in what I see as criminal activities. And you're caught in the middle. And so some of those farmers that are exiting the industry, not exiting alive, they're suiciding.
That's right. A lot are. There's no other way out for them, or so, you know, that's the way they feel. That's the level of desperation that we face.
So what are some other things that you'd like people to know? I mean, that's a pretty massive one you've just dropped on us.
Oh look, there's more to come. I guess that's the most concerning thing for anyone in this industry, and it should be of concern to anyone in the country, that the level of regulation that we face now that is destroying our businesses is far from complete. There's far more to come. In this industry, where we're going to see far more regulation of our vegetation beyond what we've got now, to the point where total ground cover will be regulated, being your physical grass cover. So you'll be told by government how much grass you can use.
Well, I'll ask you a really important question there. If you screw up your land, your property, who suffers?
We do.
Because your resale value drops.
Absolutely.
Now you're first generation farmers up here in this area.
That's
so you
right.
didn't inherit this.
No, definitely not.
Everything we see here you made.
Yeah. Yep.
That's a hell of a credit to you. It really is.
Yep. It's yeah, look, it's tough, mate, because you're constantly facing this barrage of regulation, and when you go to invest in a business of any sort, you invest in the laws of the day. Now, when regulation gets implemented beyond that point, that without compensation destroys your asset value, you're put in a very vulnerable position. Now, whether you're in debt or not, but obviously more so if you're in debt, if the value of your asset is stripped away by government with no compensation, it's a recipe for disaster.
Well, as the chair of that Senate inquiry, I saw a pattern very, very early on. Government regulation, government policy was quite often the thing that took farmers to the brink.
Yep.
The sudden stop of live exports from the north affected the whole beef industry, because those cattle that were going out went to sale down south, which dropped the prices right around the country. Yep. That took farmers to the edge, and then the banks foreclosed. The Murray-Darling Basin plan, which is not based on sound science at all, no. It's just a politically driven mess, catastrophe. Yep. That was destroying some land, and not only destroying access to water in some areas, but it was destroying the property values in whole regions and communities. There were things like your property rights as well being destroyed. All of a sudden you had a certain value of land, it was just wiped.
Mate, for the last 20 years we have had the perfect storm. Okay, you referred to the live export debacle, that was in 2011, but as you know, like, we've covered a bit of the legislation that's changed from the late 90s, so 21 years ago. But yeah, fast forward to 2011, we had the live export ban, which decimated the cattle industry. Prior to that, we had that global financial crisis, okay, which, as I said earlier there, we had government step in to guarantee deposits, made Australia a very favourable place to invest money. That saw our exchange rate sit for a number of years practically at parity with the US dollar. So we had parity in the exchange rate, which is bad for an industry that is like primary production, that is exporting. So we had high exchange rate, we had a live export ban, and then along comes a drought. How much more do you need? You can't take all three at once.
Well, I'll give you this one then. It probably doesn't affect you as much as some other farmers, but energy costs.
Oh well, that's all coming in the background as well, all this burden of legislation.
It actually does affect you. It does affect you because people
At all
have heard
costs.
hay runs. Where farmers, I know Rick Gurnett just down the road here, he drives all the way to Victoria and southern New South Wales to get hay.
Yep.
At a huge cost. You've done it too.
Yep.
Okay, so I know of 2 farmers just in the last couple of weeks I've heard of who normally plant hay or grow hay
Yep.
for fodder. They're not doing it now because energy costs are too high. Electricity costs are too high for pumping because they need irrigation to get the hay. Somewhere just up near Longreach there's Keith Gordon on a property, Parklands, and he showed me a trough that he and his wife built, and he showed me the dam that is the source of the water, and there's a power pole there. It's been there since the 80s. No one's ever hooked up a pump. He was going to, and he found out the cost of using that electricity to that area, that pump, was prohibitive. So he can't even use it in the middle of a drought. In the middle of a drought, we can't get hay because some farmers are not growing hay.
Well, that's right.
That's bloody crazy.
Mate, once again, all our inputs are energy intensive, which once again, it puts cost up. You can't have government regulation without increasing cost.
Correct.
It's inevitable. That's what happens.
Very few people say that.
You know, it's all our costs keep increasing because of government regulation. The providers of our inputs, they're not getting any bigger profits. Matter of fact, they're facing the same situation as ourselves. Their profits are decreasing.
Yes, they are.
All on the back of more government interference, chewing away at their profit.
So you've got regulations that control workplace health and safety, which you would abide by and you would condone and support. You've got regulations affecting how you use various chemicals and so on, which if you make a mess of your land, you lose the value. So you're not going to do that anyway. No. You're not going to apply if you're a crop grower, you're not going to apply excessive fertiliser. It's wasted money. No. You've got other regulations right throughout the whole industry. The Chinese don't have that, and they're exporting from a country of what, 1.2 billion people in quite a few arid areas there. They're exporting food to us.
Yeah. How smart is that? I just don't get it. You know, this is what we're faced with, and so we have to try and compete on the free market with those countries. We have no protection measures. Our government will not implement protection measures where we put tariffs on those inputs. Imports, sorry. You're
not calling for protection in the sense that you want a free ride. You're calling for you're calling for fair trade.
Exactly.
Level playing field.
Yeah.
So that the Chinese who export stuff to here, food to here, they have to have the same basic cost structure as you in order for you to compete.
Malcolm, the way I see it, the only way you can have free trade, okay, and a free market, fair market, is if we are all on a level playing field. It can't possibly be free or fair unless we're all on a level playing field. Now that means parity with our exchange rate, okay, identical parity with regulation of our industry, and then we stand a fighting chance, don't we?
Very good chances. Australia farmers are second to none.
But that's not what we have, mate.
No.
You know, like you say, we've got imports coming into this country from other places that have no regulation.
What does government do for you?
They make it bloody difficult. It's what they do.
What would water do to this country?
Oh, mate, you've got nothing without water. It's fantastic. See, our legislation now says that we can only, in the grazing industry, we can only store water for stock watering purposes. At this point, that's still free, deemed free. If we want to irrigate anything, we then have to buy an allocation to be able to irrigate. Now, we had a situation where up until the Water Act, which was another thing that came in as a result of the Beattie Howard era.
And the UN.
Yeah, well, that's where it come from, but we had the Water Act came in 2000. Now, prior to 2000, on freehold land, you own the water. All the water that fell on your land was yours. Peter Beattie brought in the Water Act.
Prior to what year?
Prior to 2000.
Okay.
Peter Beattie.
So if a farmer bought land before 2000, it was on that basis that he bought that land.
Absolutely. The water is part of the land. It's annexed to the land. But the Water Act came in and quite simply says all water is vested in the state.
State, not the Crown.
Not the Crown, in the state. So the state, the entity, the state of Queensland, just stole everyone's water and then set about a process, once again through the Murray-Darling Basin system, of selling it back to people.
And they separated water rights from land ownership.
From the property title, that's right.
And they ended up, I think Malcolm Turnbull was the water minister who did this, selling access to water rights to international entities, New York, Canada.
Absolutely.
Superannuation funds in Canada.
So the rain that falls on our property here, on our 14,000 hectares, goes into the Murray-Darling Basin system, and if I want to use some of that for agriculture, I've got to buy that back. Other than that, I've just got to let it run down the creek.
Hey, I've got a great deal for you.
Go on.
Got a big coat hanger in Sydney I can sell you.
Yeah.
And mate, if you settle within an hour, I'll throw in some big shells right next to it. Yeah.
I mean, it's
But
just,
how come no one's talking about these things?
well, I think there's more and more frustration as time goes by. You know, it's like anything. When these things are thrust on you, and in this industry, look, you really are under the pump time-wise. You know, it's a daylight till dark and beyond thing. So you don't have time to deal with every single thing that hits the table until such times as the burden of it gets so much that you just can't continue, and then you start looking at it. That is what I think is starting to happen now. People in agriculture are starting to look at it and go, well, I just can't continue. What is going on? Where can we go from here? So, you know, we are at that point where people are starting to wake up and starting to raise these issues. Why is it like this?
Well, we've been talking about it now for quite a while, pretty vigorously. Some of your mates just down the road are into carbon farming. Based on rubbish.
Yeah,
Rubbish.
absolutely.
There's no science to base up the need to control carbon dioxide. It's not carbon, it's carbon dioxide.
It's plant food, Malcolm. You know, we could not exist on this planet without carbon dioxide, and our businesses alone, right, if you're in the grazing industry or the agricultural production industry, you are essentially a carbon farmer.
Yes.
Your business, your whole production output relies on carbon dioxide being in the atmosphere and you being able to sequester it on your land.
And the thing is, Dan, I can get around that if I'm a climate alarmist by saying you only need a little bit of a pollution to tip the scales. But carbon dioxide is not a pollutant, and it's a trace gas anyway. But the really significant thing is that in 2009, as a result of the global financial crisis, there was a global recession. Okay, it didn't hit every country, but overall there was a recession. The industrial production went down in 2009. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere continued increasing. And the science shows that it doesn't matter how much carbon dioxide we produce, we cannot affect the level in the atmosphere for the simple reason that the oceans control that, and the temperature of the oceans. They liberate as the oceans rise in temperature, they liberate as they cool, they absorb. Happens seasonally. It does this. And anyway.
Malcolm, are you saying that Tim Flannery got it wrong?
Tim Flannery got a lot of money for misrepresenting the science. He's a communicator, not a scientist, in my opinion. But let's have a look at fishing industry, because that's food again.
Yep.
Australia has the largest continental shelf fishing zone in the world. We have a small population. We should be able to feed ourselves.
Absolutely.
Almost three quarters of the seafood we eat in this country comes from overseas. And which country has 36% of the world's marine parks?
I'm guessing it's us.
Yeah, Australia. So we've got this huge burden of locking up our fishing zones, and then China, the most populous nation in the world, exports seafood to us, and it has a smaller coastline. And so our number one source of food, seafood, is China. And number two source of food is Thailand, which has an even smaller coastline and a population about 3 times ours. It's bloody crazy. We're killing our country.
It is. So to fast forward from what we said earlier about I indicated that, you know, we're not at the end yet. There's more regulation coming. All the pain that we have felt up until now has essentially been Kyoto. UN.
With no scientific backing.
No. That's what's caused us the pain up until now. But now we've just had the Federal Coalition sign us up to Paris. And it doesn't mean a continuation of the same. It does mean that, but it means more.
Yeah.
We need more. we the producers will have to give more.
Meanwhile, our coal, which is the best coal in the world, is exported so that the Chinese, the Japanese, the other Asian countries can produce cheap electricity, clean, cheap electricity,
Yep.
and sell it to their businesses, their manufacturers, at a cheaper price than we can buy electricity in this country. And we're buying solar panels from the Chinese, who use our coal to make the solar panels. We're buying wind turbines from the Chinese, who use our coal to make the wind turbines, and then export it down here.
Mate,
And then we use subsidies. So we now have a very high, we've gone from the lowest price of electricity in the world to the highest.
Mate, we're not on the grid here. Okay, this property's not on the grid. We cannot make the figures stack up to work on solar or wind. It just doesn't work. You know, even though there are generous taxpayer-funded subsidies out there,
Don't tell me
we've never gone anywhere near it.
Don't tell me you use diesel.
We do. Terrible, isn't
Carbon dioxide, eh?
it? Terrible.
So, anything else you wanted to mention?
Oh, mate, look, I think the most concerning thing for me and my family, and I think this extends to everybody, is what's still to come. That's what really concerns me the most.
You scared me when you revealed what's coming with the
property law
reform.
is the biggest issue I see that we are facing in the near future.
To use the famous saying, we ain't seen nothing yet.
That's right.
You've got something far more insidious coming down.
Exactly. You know, we had the Queensland Government commissioned a review into the Property Law Act back in 2016
Under the LNP?
Under the LNP.
2016?
2015, I think it might have been. Sorry, late 2015. That review has just been completed by the Queensland University of Technology, supported by the Queensland Law Society. Mate, those guys have handed down their report containing 232 recommendations to the Property Law Act. Now, the Property Law Act, in my opinion, should be seen as the holy grail of property rights. It is. That's what it is.
And property rights are fundamental to freedom, basic freedom and responsibility.
If you don't have property rights, you really don't have much at all. So, as I say, 232 recommendations. Now, from my investigation into this, mate, this is all very bad news. So at some point in the near future, we're going to see legislation pushed through the Queensland Parliament.
Well, the tactic that the UN used is to bury people in 3,000-page reports. And there's no science that supports them, their claim on climate. We're affecting climate. None at all. And what this report you're talking about, you said,
well, mate, it's 1,020 pages.
So, what did you call that? Legislation by language, or what was it? Control by language? They say they're changing a few keywords. It's nothing. Just type
they call it modernising the language. Modernising.
But they're taking keywords out and replacing them.
Exactly.
Let's change the fundamental premise.
Yeah, definitely. So that's yet to come. And as I say, under the Coalition's Paris Agreement, we're now going to face a lot more environmental legislation as well. I mean, once you take away property rights and you control the environment that we work in, all facets of the environment, you make the the business environment untenable.
So let's be clear about that again. I'll ask the question again. Pauline and I have been very, very strong in saying for a number of years now that the best person to manage the land is the owner of the land, because if the owner, he or she, screws up, they wear the costs in lower resale value. They can't hand it over to their kids as a productive asset.
Yeah.
So rather than some bureaucrat in West End or Canberra or Sydney controlling the land, we'd be far better, because they've got no responsibility.
That's right.
No responsibility. They won't pay the costs.
I mean, I think I take your point, but essentially it's not even a bureaucrat in Canberra or Brisbane wanting to control our land. It's the UN.
Geneva and New York.
Exactly.
They're
the ones wanting to control our land, and they've just got a few bureaucratic puppets here to see that it happens.
And a lot of these provisions don't go through Parliament.
No.
They just get exercised, but the federal government controls.
We've already reached a point, Malcolm, I think, where there's been some fundamental changes that have gone through, particularly in the Beattie era, in relation to Queensland and Howard federally, that have really created a devastating situation where, you know, like a lot of this legislation is self-fueling. Once they change something, they can change one act, they can change another 10. And so a lot of the groundwork was done under the Howard-Beattie era. I'm not saying it can't be reversed, of course it can be, but we certainly need people to get rid of this political ignorance that's driving this whole thing.
And not only that, Dan, we need to call for either restoring your property rights, which you bought, or compensating you.
That takes the injustice out of everything, mate. Okay?
So,
the only reason the injustice arises is because of the lack of compensation.
So that's really up to the federal government now to come clean and either compensate or restore property rights. And so how do you want to do it? Because the farmers are going to get that money.
Look, you know, there's been a few questions thrown around at the federal government since the Queensland government made the last amendments to the Veg Act earlier this year in April. The feds keep wiping their hands of it. Oh, it's a state issue, we can't touch that. Well, look, that's just rubbish, absolute rubbish. The feds have caused the whole problem. They can certainly fix it if they have the desire.
So there are a lot of pressures on farmers. Why do you enjoy it?
Mate, I see it as an industry whereby I like a challenge. It is certainly
like a challenge.
It's certainly challenging. I see it as a fantastic industry in which to raise a family, which was primarily, you know, why I wanted to continue on with essentially the upbringing that I had, whilst you know, we certainly didn't, like, this isn't a multi-generational property. There's no multi-generational business model that's been adopted here. It is an industry that I am passionate about and basically wanted to bring my family in it. There are not too many other industries where you can involve your family to such an extent as we can here. We're certainly not here to be, and I mean no disrespect by saying this, to be the next Kerry Packer or Gina Reinhardt. You know, we're not. If we wanted to make money, big money, we wouldn't be here. But like I say, I'm passionate about this industry and bringing my family up in this environment, and it is that type of industry where you can do that.
Okay. You've got a Kiwi wife.
Yep.
You've got to stop her barracking for the All Blacks, mate. You've got to do that. Come on.
Mate, when you live in a remote location like this, you're pretty damn lucky that you've got a cook to come home to. So, you know.
Well, she's lovely. But the thing is, she's come from very green country.
Yep.
In New Zealand. So what does she like about the area?
I think same as myself. You know, our whole goal from the time we got married was to be able to get ourselves into this industry, into this environment. So for all the same reasons as myself, mate. You know, it's family. I mean, we sit down practically every meal. We sit down to a table together. We talk. We don't have all those other outside distractions. You know, we're a couple of hours drive from town, so we only go there once a month, once every, 3 weeks, something like that. Sometimes we go 6 weeks without going to town. We don't mind our own company, and
you can see that too.
We enjoy it. You know, we enjoy it. We love being able to produce something that we can look back on and be proud of.
Yeah, and that's more than just beef.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what I want to say is thank you very much, because people may not know it, but this man is fighting for not only his rights. You're fighting because you've dared to try and manage your own fodder. He's facing criminal. You are under criminal charges.
I am deemed a criminal now, yes, because we're actually in the appeal process. So we're taking the government to court as such on appeal. But yes, I am deemed a criminal for feeding my cattle, my own property.
Keep them alive.
Yep, to keep them alive.
And make a living.
Yep. In
a way that you signed up to when you bought this place.
Absolutely. In a very sustainable way that's been happening since European settlement.
Yeah. So what we need to say is let's return to reality, get back to basics to bring back Australia. That's basically it. And as you keep saying, it's common sense.
It is.
All you want and all Katrina wants is a fair go.
Absolutely. If we are going to be denied the right to exercise beneficial ownership of our property, is it too much to ask to be compensated? We'll go.
Or restored.
Well, we'd prefer it to be restored. Yeah. We really would. And look, as a nation, it needs to be restored, because you can't possibly continue on this path that we're on.
Very good point. So it's restoration or compensation.
Yeah. But either way, you cannot continue on this path that we're on. You cannot continue increasing population. I mean, we've even got a government contemplating a major migration agreement, right, to bring more migrants in here. You can't possibly contemplate increasing population and decreasing food production.
Great point.
Just, it doesn't work.
How about we go for a walk around and you can show us some of the things that you've built?
Yep.
All right, thank you very much.
Yep. Thanks, Malcolm.
Good on you.
Beauty.